Over the past week or so, I've been having this back and forth in the YouTube comments about whether I support open source software. And no matter what I say to this guy, he is 100% set in believing that I support it, because he refuses to accept that this is not a simple yes or no question, and it actually requires some nuance. So just in case there's anyone else out there who is as confused as this guy, I thought I should actually explain my nuanced opinion. Firstly, we have to be clear about what we actually mean by open source software, because like with free software, open source is an absolute linguistic mess that never needed to exist and should never have persisted to this date. So free software can mean free as in freedom respecting, but also free as in free of charge. And likewise, open source can mean the open source software movement, which, like the free software movement, has its own tenets that have to be followed to actually fit under that banner, but it can also mean the English definition of the source code is available. Now, as for the capitalized open source movement under the banner of the Open Source Initiative, I don't really care for them. I'll get into why in just a bit. As for the English meaning of open source where the source code is available though, I 100% support this. If my option is going to be the software will be proprietary or it will be English open source, I want that software to be open source. But when the software is open source like this, it doesn't specify how the software actually is licensed. Is it licensed as free software? Is it licensed as open source under the movement? Or is it licensed as Creative Commons? Or maybe something else that happens in the future? Ages ago, I did a video explaining the differences between the free software movement and the open source software movement, but in short, free software cares about user freedom as described by the 4 essential freedoms. The freedom to run the program as you wish for any purpose, the freedom to study how the program works and change it so it does your computing as you wish. Access to the source code is a precondition for this, the freedom to redistribute copies so you can help others, and the freedom to distribute copies of your modified version to others. By doing this, you can give the whole community a chance to benefit from your changes. Access to the source code is a precondition for this. Whereas open source software, while still being open source by the English meaning, as with free software, it takes a more pragmatic approach from a business perspective, where it still takes advantage of things like community development, public auditing, easy commercialization, but most open source licenses also allow you to take the source code proprietary at will. This makes it so it's much easier to actually make money from that project rather than having to get around the restrictions that exist with free software to actually protect the users. So if the question is open source or free software, when it comes to projects that I work on, I am always going to make those free software because I just don't really have a reason for them to not be. And if I'm going to commit to someone else's project, it's probably also going to be a free software project. But I am not a god, and I understand that when you are working with other people, compromise actually is important. And I would prefer there to be something in the correct direction rather than no steps at all. So let's say that Microsoft has a new project. I don't think Microsoft, of all companies, is ever going to release something as free software unless they just don't care about it whatsoever. So the chances that will actually go through is basically zero. So open source is as good as we're going to get. And many other companies are like this. I don't think that you're going to have much progress actually making massive companies like that actually support free software. So let's say that I was a project leader at Microsoft and the executives say to me, hey Brody, do we make this project proprietary or do we make it open source? 100% of the time, I am going to say make it open source as defined by the open source movement. And as we established earlier, this isn't because I support the open source software movement and I think it's better than free software. It's because it's a less bad result than having more proprietary software out there, because even though it's not free software, you still have the option to go and audit the repo and go and fork the repo, make a derived work, remove things that are potentially dangerous additions. Let's say there's some really weird telemetry that's in there and you go and take that out in a fork, and you can add changes in that are being ignored by the developers. You can then go and redistribute that work and have a overall better version of the project. Let's say it's something like VS Codium, for example. I think VS Code is an absolutely amazing text editor, but Microsoft adds some really sketchy stuff into their release. So VS Codium basically just strips all that out. If VS Code was proprietary, that just wouldn't be able to happen. And this isn't just a Microsoft thing. There are countless other examples out there where I would prefer the software to at least just be open source, because even though it's not free software, it is a step in the correct direction. However, some projects out there take a step in the other direction and go from being free software to more like open source software, even if their license doesn't exactly say so. So if we look at, say, the Audacity example, for basically its entire existence, it was a GPL v2 or later project, and this was fine. It was free software, no one really complained. Then the project got some new owners who weren't really happy with it being free software and brought in the contributor license agreement. Now, this wasn't used to actually change the license, at least at this stage. But with this CLA, because the contributions of the project can be used in any way, it operated more like an open source project, even though it had this free software license. This is something that I can never support. The problem you have here, as well as when the license changes from being free software to being an open source license, is you have all of these existing contributions. These contributions were made under the assumption the project would always be free software. But by changing that license or changing how the contributions can be made, it basically throws away any of that goodwill that had been built up over the existence of the project. I'm sure there are other situations I can think of, but those are the main ones that I think really matter. I can absolutely respect the dedication of the hardcore free software guys where everything must be free software, even down to your BIOS level. That, I think, is a great stance to have if you're trying to actually push a movement forward. But I'm not the most hardcore guy out there. I'm at least willing to make some compromise in situations where some compromise is the best you're actually going to get. There absolutely is a point where I hard stop that compromise, but I'm willing to at least accept some sort of gains in the correct direction rather than throwing everything away altogether. Maybe you think that's an absolutely horrible position to hold, and I'm completely wrong. If that is the case, let me know in the comment section down below. Or maybe you could make a website called Why Brody Is Wrong and host it on something like Linode. If it runs on Linux, you can run it on Linode. They have the distros you'd expect available like Ubuntu and Debian, but also Arch and Gentoo because why not? They've got multiple server plans available, so whether you want to host a blog or even a personal VPN, there'll be one that fits you. I'll be using Linode to host all of my community game nights. If you need help, Linode has 24/7, 365 support available by phone, regardless of your plan size. Right now, you guys can get started on Linode with $100 credit by going to the link on screen or in the description down below. Linode was in the game 3 years before Amazon entered cloud computing, so you know they know their stuff. A huge thank you to Linode for sponsoring the channel. That is going to be everything for me, and before I go, I would like to thank my supporters. So a special thank you to Joachim, Donald, Logan, Michael, Andrew, Nathan, David, Carl, Mitchell, Will, Brennan, Chica Bento, Jamie, Joseph, Josh, Peter D, Stephen Tees, through Tony Tushar, and all of my $2 supporters. If you would like to go and support my work, there are links down below to my Patreon, subscribe, start, LibrePay, all that sort of stuff. I've got my podcast, Tech Over Tea, available basically anywhere. I've got a gaming channel called Brody Robertson Plays, where I live stream twice a week, as well as upload a couple of YouTube shorts. And this channel is available over on Odyssey. That'll be everything for me, and I bumped my mic.